if you're looking at the size and length of this video, you may notice that it's quite a bit shorter. This is so for a few reasons. First, this time of the term, in class or out of class, everyone is just tanking. You've got to be like me. You've got to be looking at the end of this thing and going, oh man, I'm just looking to finish this up, right? I've enjoyed reading a lot of this material again, but preparing lessons in classes is every bit as tiring as actually doing the assignments yourself. So I also am looking forward to taking a break here in a little while, but we're going to try to finish strong. Last week I put up on the website, or on the Canvas site rather, which is a website, whatever, the final project rubric. I did the best I could to explain what I was looking for. The problem with any kind of textual analysis, be it in essay form or just listing things, is that it's very hard to explain exactly how to do it. This is an art, not a science. And I mean that literally. In a scientific experiment, there are rules, there are protocols to follow. There are ways to judge empirically whether you have arrived where you need to be. A work of art is not like that. There's many different ways to get in and out. There's lots of different things to see. A lot of it relies on your ability to argue well or to explain well. So if we were to be in class, we'd have a chance to do a lot of more interactive exercises to kind of illustrate this. I am still working on how to do that remotely. It's very hard. The best we can do is fire assignments back and forth, but at this point in the term, it's a little late to start doing that. So I thought what I would do here today is very briefly, or as briefly as possible, walk you through how I do an activity like this. Here's the obvious title. Now, everything you're about to read, I am leaving totally unedited. If you ever wanted to sort of a look at how I work when I read a text, this is sort of the best way to do it. I almost inevitably start off with an idea of exactly what I want to do and then figure out why that's not going to work, and I sort of start all over again. Some of you are very, very organized. You can work by outlines. You can work by close lists. I have never been able to do that. I think as I do things. So as a writer, I can't set up an outline and make my points and then put them into print. I just have to go. I just improvise. Whatever comes on the page, I just throw out there, and then I come around to a more ordered presentation later. Now, you may be wondering, well, then why have you made us make lists of 15 observations and then make interpretations? The main reason I have done that is to get you to realize, if you haven't already, and you may already, just how important observation is. It's very easy to take one thing and run with it without paying attention to all the stuff around it. Now, I have been doing this for so long that it's very hard for me to break down exactly how it goes. So I'm going to try to just walk you briefly through how I would do an assignment like the close reading I have given you, although you'll see by the end, I'm basically starting to write an essay. I'm not going to actually put an essay up here, but if I were to write an essay, it would work a little bit like what you're about to read. So now here's where I started. I just said, I'm going to take quotes that I think are kind of weird or interesting, and I'm going to put them down, and then I'm going to make observations about them like I told the students to do. And where I started was all the descriptions of funeral practices. Even now, I couldn't really tell you exactly why I think those are so interesting. I don't know if the same thing hits you. If you're like every other reader, different things will hit you. Maybe it's the bars. Maybe it's the weird sanitation squads. Whatever. There may be something that grabs you. And when you find something that grabs you, that's what you should go for. Don't ask yourself why. Just go for it. So, put all these quotes down on here. And I thought to myself, cool, I'm going to make a list of observations. Now, I think I may have actually deleted that slide. I did. So, I had started to make a list of observations and then realized that wasn't going to work because my brain is just not that organized. It's just not. But then I found that there's actually only one of those passages that I really think is interesting. And it's the fourth quote there that starts at the bottom of each pit. And I realized as I read it again that it's very odd for this narrative. Most of what you read in this narrative is very, very, very dry. unemotional, dispassionate, I think is a good word for it. And so I asked the question down at the bottom, whether the narrator's dispassionate tone is just an affectation or whether he really is dispassionate. In other words, is this just something he's pretending to be for some reason, or does he really just not give a crap? Because when you look at this quote, look how it ends. You have this long description, for at least for this narrative, a long description. And then you have, on the following day, the next of kin were asked to sign the register of burials, which showed the distinction that can be made between men and, for example, dogs. Men's deaths are checked and entered up. That's a really cold joke, right? If I was talking about mass graves in a war zone, and then I said, well, at least that makes us different from animals. We keep a list. How would you take it? Yeah, you might kind of chuckle. You might be horrified, maybe both. Why put this in here? You'll notice a lot of this. By the way, I'm not going to read everything on every slide. You can read this later if you want to get an idea of how I work. Now, boom. I immediately just start writing. What you're reading, I have not edited. I haven't tried to organize differently. I'm just writing, right? Now, I start out by asking myself whether or not the narrator's tone is serious or not. And I just kind of go, right? I notice, for example, that unlike every other passage you're going to read, this one has descriptions like the ground that seethes and steams, that a low ridge of quicklime threw up bubbles that burst in the air above it. The bodies are naked and contorted, when every other section in the sequence, there's no description of bodies. In fact, for the most part, they're hidden from view. They're in coffins, they're in trucks. This is the very first time we see bodies that are naked and contorted, which is a peculiar thing to do because there's no new disease. It's not like we need to have a reminder of what's happening to bodies, right? Nothing new is happening that we know of. So for this kind of narrative, this is a strangely graphic and descriptive passage, and it's followed by something that's not at all that way. Now, when I was going through this, what I wanted to try to demonstrate was actually the writer has a really snarky sense of humor, and we're seeing that leak through. But then when you consider the fact that the vast majority of this book is the exact opposite, you have to ask yourself, well, maybe this is who he is, who the narrator is meant to be. So I keep writing here. I end up finding an interesting link between the fact that the tone of what the narrator's doing in this novel is eerily similar to someone filling out a register. Just recording details, doesn't matter what they are, they just have to be written down, right? Now, from that, I draw the idea, an interpretation, an inference, if you like, because this is somebody who survived the plague, that the narrator has been completely compromised by it. The narrator is no longer able to describe for us his feelings about the event. Whenever we get a passage where that does happen, the narrator undercuts it with some sort of snarky joke or official language. So the narrator is himself a victim in this narrative, right? Before we even get to the events themselves, we are reading how a victim processes these things. And I put down here the greatest loss in the novel is thus not even life, but the ability to see meaning and power in things. This is not uncommon. And in fact, I would argue it's a very realistic portrayal of, realistic from my point of view, not from someone who's actually experienced it. You may remember in Maus, there are lots of times when Vladek Spiegelman, it sounds like he's relating Auschwitz, but he doesn't seem all that bothered. Sometimes he just seems to be recounting, oh yeah, that's a thing that happened, and his readers were horrified. And of course, Spiegelman's art gives us a window onto that. But there are ways in which survivors of tragedies like this simply have grown calloused or numb in that spot, and we're seeing this in print now. This is all just sort of my improvising, just letting it go, writing it down. Then I start one of the assignments I put up there. So I'm not going to put all 15 observations, but now when I work, I just have to write down a bunch of stuff first and then do the observations last. So I just go back in and find the things that I've already observed and put them in a list. You're totally welcome to do that. If you're someone who so far has found these assignments a little irritating because you're not able to just first observe, then interpret, totally fine. It doesn't matter how you get them done, And so obviously, of course, I'm not going to give you all 15, because if you want, you can go back and read them for yourself. Now, interpretation. Again, I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can read it later if you want. But this is, if you're shooting for a mid to high A, this is the kind of length and description and detail you want to do. Okay? Because ultimately, I'm arriving in a place where I'm putting all of my observations to work, trying to describe what the narrator is and how his suffering and experiences affect how we read, right? So this is a short passage, but the importance in reading it the way I have is that it allows us to understand exactly where to locate the tragedy in this novel. And it is not, as you might expect, the loss of life. It is, in fact, the survivors who in many ways are the real victims. Because those who are dead, those who have survived, if they are anything like the narrator, are shells of themselves. They record events and move from one breath to the next, but they don't really survive. You might recall in Maus, not just in Maus, but Art Spiegelman's mother killed herself. Also not uncommon. Survivors from events like this often either find themselves just moving from one breath to the next or never really surviving the way they wanted to. I don't know if any of you in school have read Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut, but that's a fascinating, weird, and in some ways funny description of a man who literally, as Vonnegut starts the novel off, saying Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. The implication is that this is someone who never actually literally moved on from the firebombing of Dresden in World War II, but is bopping back and forth in time. That's very similar here. The person the narrator who experienced this has never really moved on and is not even really alive, is still stuck remembering these things in a very dry fashion. My goal in all that was not to say, this is what you must do, right? There's a grading scale going down even to B-. If you're fried, you're not able to do the work, you're getting out with a B or a B-. And so you're likely to either keep an A or at least get a high B, one way or the other. You're not looking at bombing out of this class if you can't do the assignment exactly the way you want to. I'm giving you an idea of how to approach it, right? Let yourself just kind of find out what method works for you. Some of you may find it easier to make a nice, neat list than very delicately or methodically interpret one or two things. Some of you, like me, are a mess. You just got to go. Got to improvise, battle rap it, just go, and then pick up the pieces and circle back around, which is what I usually do, to the actual thing after it's over. That's kind of how I work. But for those of you really shooting for a mid to high A, I'm going to expect a lot of detail, a lot of thought put into the interpretation. I've tried to give you a few guidelines for them. You're not going to be saying things, for example, like, wow, the narrator's tone is dry. I interpret that to mean that he's a dry person, right? That's not much of an interpretation. Interpretation is meant to open the text up, right? Not to, I don't know, whatever. This symbolizes butterflies. Who cares, right? But to build on these observations and allow us to read and appreciate what we're seeing in a different kind of way. Exactly the same way you would if you were showing someone around a city. They look at a row of shops and go, wow, a row of shops. And you go, hang on a second, though. Behind those shops or in those shops, there's actually a small food truck that makes the best burritos you've ever had, right? You can't really see it from here. You can kind of see it, but you got to know where it is, right? Same thing. You're opening the text up to the reader to see things they might not see otherwise. That's the goal. It requires a lot of practice. It requires a lot of time. So do the best you can with it. I'm going to post that PowerPoint up on the site just so you can kind of see it. If you want to read the whole thing, you can. You don't have to. Email me questions If you're not sure if one thing you're doing is the way you should do it or not, feel free to send me some thoughts, some questions. I'll be happy to answer them. And in the meantime, we've still got a couple of weeks left, so hopefully you will have time to do it.